A Kangaroo Fern production.
The world is very forgiving of what you do. So here's the thing. I did not learn any of this when I started episode 1 of my very first show. I wasn't like, hey, let me find a podcast to give me an idea of the industry before I dive into it. No. I had my interest. I had the desire to. I had my script, which is my story, and I had a microphone, and I just talked into it. That was it. I did not think about, oh, will I be judged, or will I be canceled, or will someone hate me for, pushing this story out? No, the world was quite forgiving the very first time I released my first episode. Mastery is not done at first step. Mastery is done over time. It is a gradual process, and podcasting in itself is a gradual process. If you can understand that, if you can embody that, then you will do perfectly well as a podcaster within Asia, as well as a podcaster in general. Because, even if you're trying to tackle a specific market, for example, you're still going to get listeners all around the world. So you will do just fine.
Hello, Team Pod Fiesta. It's another episode of That Podcast Exchange. And for this episode, we're talking about the podcasting ecosystem on Asian market. So Asian podcasting scene. And of course, who knows everything about Asian podcasting? Our guest for today is Norman Chella. So he has been in on Asian podcasting scene for quite some time now. So he is the Chief of Business Development of Renegade Radio, and of course the host of Pod Lovers Asia. Please welcome Norman Chella. Welcome to the show, Norman.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting me on the show.
Yeah, it's been a while. So the last time I spoke to you and I invited you to the Pod Fiesta Summit, that's in April. Yeah. That's a long time ago. And now invited you again for my podcast show. So you have a podcast. I think you have 6 podcasts that you in your belt right now. So there is a Pod Lover Asia. There's a Tempered Fables. This is Norm and Anti-Fu. Can you tell me how it all started that you love podcasting?
I would say it's sort of a recent thing when compared to the rest of my life or something like that. I started in 2017. I have a hobby of writing short story fiction on the side, just like, fantasy stuff or sci-fi stuff. And I started writing short stories on Quora, which is the question and answer website. So any question that comes up, I rather answer in a very fun way, like a very narrative format. And I wanted to challenge myself. So I started to write these answers this way. And at the same time, I started going to prose and poetry meetups where people are, performing or expressing poetry, etc. On one of these meetups, someone shared a podcast episode. They just played it on their phone. And it was probably 10 minutes of the most beautiful audio I've ever heard in my life. I still remember it up until now. It's still my favorite episode of all time. It is the Dreamland episode from the show Memory Palace, made by Nate DeMeo. So I didn't think that a podcast can make me feel that way. I never had that kind of experience before. And I've heard of the word podcast, but I didn't really care for it that much. I just thought that it was just some kind of show with people just talking over on a microphone, almost like radio. But we know how different it is right now. So at one point in time, there was a short story writing competition that came up, and I wanted to write a story. But when I wrote the story, on the last day, I backed out. I didn't actually send it in. I was just scared or afraid or ashamed or something like that. But it was such a waste to write this thing for the competition, but I ended up not publishing anything. And I thought of the image of someone reading like a storybook or a fable and making voices and making sound effects, and there's like a huddle of group of people as they're sitting by the campfire and they're listening to someone tell the story. And I wanted to emulate that for this story. So I made my first podcast episode. I just, I bought a Blue Yeti, just like every beginner podcaster would. I bought the most popular microphone at the time. I brought it with me to the office at like 6 a.m. and I started recording and learning how to do like audio editing. And that's the first episode of Tempered Fables, which is one of the shows that you mentioned. So that became my foray into the world of podcasting. But then years in, I was worried about things like, what's happening in Asia? Because most of the time we were listening to shows from the US, the UK, Australia, mainly Western shows, pretty much, if you just want to generalize it that way. And I wanted to know what is the local scene there. So I expanded my repertoire of shows from narrative shows or just for fun ideas into conversational shows, into interviews, into deep dives and analyses of the ecosystem. And I guess that's where I am right now, because my curiosity and my almost frustration with the lack of coverage around me has led me to picking up another show idea and then launching that show and then continuing that show and then interviewing more and more people, understanding their side of podcasting, understanding their side of whatever the show is about. And that show was Pod Lovers Asia is focusing on podcasting, and then Anti-Fool is focusing on what I call building my own textbook of the world. So how can I comprehend it? And there's other shows as well coming in. So yeah, that's where I am. I'll to answer your question, no, podcasting is not a natural thing. It just became the easiest form of expression for me, but it just came in at the right time. So that's where I am right now.
All right, thank you, Norman. So I was talking to James Cridland the other day for another episode of the podcast exchange, and he said that nowadays it's not all about the English language. Now there's a different language that is getting more higher on the podcasting. Instead of English only, he also said that like India, it's getting bigger in podcasting. So you don't need and he said Hindi is one of the biggest now language in podcasting. What is your opinion about that as well, Norman?
I would say it's definitely up there. I'm not sure if it's the second largest after English. I would like to challenge that, but maybe James has better data than I do. But I mean, I can totally look that up later, because I was thinking Spanish would be the biggest after English. But in particular to Hindi, the thing is the Indian podcasting market is huge, and it's a bit deceiving to hear something like this, because you're only hearing it as all of it comes from one country. Whenever we think about podcasting ecosystems, we think about, the US market, or, the UK market, or, if I want to tackle the French podcasting market, I go to France, right? So you assume in relation to other countries, this one country that's majority French may constitute a large percentage of the French podcasting market. And because it's only within one country, you think, okay, it's probably not as big as other languages. But the thing is, India is a huge country. We're talking about 1 billion plus people. And not only that, so many different languages, cultures stem from India that I'm not surprised that Hindi is going to be, or already is, the second largest after English. And even more so, now that I'm thinking about it, the more that I'm trying to articulate this, probably the only reason why Hindi is the second largest at this point is because English has been already at the forefront of the development of podcasting as a medium, because we've only started podcasting very recently, 2004, 2005. And then from 04, 05, that technology has spread across the world, but in small points. But South Korea has looked at that technology, and now they have a stable podcasting market. The Korean podcasting market is just huge in South Korea. In comparison, India has this amazingly large population that is very receptive to audio as a medium of consumption. So in one of the conversations that I had in Pod Lovers Asia, it was with Abhishek Bakshi, who is also another analyst of the podcasting market, but he focuses mainly on India. So we were going back and forth on this. I'd like to say, just from stemming from that conversation and from what James is saying here, Hindi, the Hindi podcasting market is up there, and it's probably going to stay up there just because everybody's adopting it, the medium, at a super fast rate in India.
All right, thank you for that. So, what is, because you are focusing on our Asian ecosystem on podcasting, what is trending right now in Asian market, especially in Asian region, in relation with podcasting? Is there any new platform, new opportunities, or new revenues for the Asian market?
We'd have to define new here. When we say new within the podcasting space, we have to say new within the Asian podcasting space. When we see or compare these ideas, these innovations in relation to other markets, it's not that new. And I'll try to explain this in greater detail. So there has been an uptrend in developments for monetizing podcasts, but at a smaller scale. This is because one of the reasons why trying to define the Asian podcasting ecosystem is difficult is because each country has their own specific needs, specific wants, specific cultures, specific subcultures. Some countries have mixed cultures, like Malaysia, that's an example, right? Or Singapore or Indonesia, while others have greater synergy with, say, their broadcasting laws or their regulations or their need to uptick or bring in more and more potential listeners. How can we access them depending on the penetration rate of technology within that country? So these are some examples that hinder these things, which means that when you want to test a new idea in the Asian podcasting space, or even any podcasting space, you have to look at what's happening over there, what's worked, what doesn't work, and what references outside of this context can we analyze so that we can be reassured that trying this out is okay. Like, it's not that much of a waste of time. That being said, it's very difficult to do so. But some of the trends I've noticed are that when a show gains a minimum number or a minimum traction in being able to monetize the show, being able to sustain the show. And when I say sustain, I mean the cost of upkeeping the show is equaled or canceled by revenue, or that it is enough that you're able to outsource it to a production company or something like that. This is, I think, on the uprise here in Asia, especially in the ASEAN region, so the Southeast Asia region, at a smaller scale. And when I say scale, I mean numbers, at smaller numbers than in other regions, like in Western markets. What do I mean by this? When we look at what is considered a monetizable show, most of the time we speak of 3 to 4 digits of unique listens per episode. Things like, 5,000 listens per episode or something like that. That's like a minimum critical mass number of listeners who you may consider be large enough to be like, you can make money if we advertise something. In Asia, there is a trend in lowering that number to pick up more shows to support. So if you are a podcaster, you might be looking at 500 listens per episode, 1,000, 2,000. And that is more than enough for companies within Asia to consider you a prime channel to advertise their products or advertise their services. So I would say it's a very strange trend, because it's like, we are aware that the ecosystem is not uniform across these countries. But because they are not uniform, it means that we are more forgiving of the scale and the size of each podcast. So we're able to test and experiment with each of these business models. Yeah. So, like, to summarize what I've just, before I ramble on, to summarize what I'm just saying is that smaller shows are picking up in terms of success, in terms of revenue, but don't expect similar numbers to Western markets. We'll have to start like experimenting on different models at smaller scales and at smaller experimental timeframes, so that we can see the natural response of listeners within that country specifically. Because that second part there, that response of the market, of of demand within each country is very, very unique to each and every country, and even I don't know all of that.
Oh, that's interesting, Norman. So it's an opposite from the Western, because usually the Western you have to
Yeah.
be more downloads so that you can get
Yes.
more revenue. But on our end, on the Asian market, it's not on the downloads, but it's is that because of also the content as well? So the advertiser looking on the quality of the content aside from the minimal download.
Yeah. So I would now, I cannot give you an absolute answer, but I would like to agree with that. And this is mainly because when looking at or theorizing a podcasting market in relation to the content available, of course the largest language market is the English language market. There's just like a bajillion genres, ideas, and shows for everybody, right? For maybe there's even an interview show just about chairs or something, right? That's amazing, right? That's you have a full spectrum of creativity to be allowed for a show. We don't know if this can be replicated in Malay or Hindi or Telugu, right, or Tagalog. We're not sure. We also don't know that even if you have these shows replicated into these genres and put into this culture and this language, that you'll get the same response. The same people who might be interested in a podcast about fishing in English may not necessarily have the same behaviors as someone who may be doing the same thing or interested in the same thing in Malay or in Bahasa Indonesia. In English, people are very, very forgiving of what kind of content is available. But in Asian countries, what I've noticed at least, and this is maybe akin to the fact that we're still technically early, but it's still exponentially rising. The shows that are picking up really well right now, the non-English language shows, they do the job of convincing someone to be introduced to the world of podcasting. That's one. And two, be convinced to listen to their show about something that they resonate with. So if a Malay listener just hears about podcasting for the first time, they would first want to listen to a show that is resonating with their current lifestyle, their current way of thinking, their default. They find shows that they resonate with, which means that all of the available ideas or shows within each and every language, if you start looking, it will be heavily related to the culture that it is born in. That being said, that sounds quite obvious, but the thing is, podcasting as a medium is it's very liberal and accepting in terms of what ideas are allowed or what ideas will thrive, which is hard when you want to think about, say, okay, I'm a podcaster in this specific country. What ideas work the best in, say, a country like Thailand? I'm not sure. Maybe I need to speak native Thai. I need to start listening into other Thai shows. And even then, would they resonate with my show idea? I don't know. These content, the most successful show ideas in Asian countries work in direct parallel with the cultures that they are aimed at. This is almost like niching for the creator, except that you and you know this as well because you're a podcaster as well. You as a show creator, you can pivot anytime you want. You can broaden anytime you want. You can narrow down anytime you want. That's why the mission of the show is so important, but the content itself is the pull that will attract those of a specific culture, those of a specific audience. But the mission should be parallel to the culture that you are trying to penetrate into. That's a very long-winded answer of saying that if you have culture-specific shows, you may not get the same level of listens as, say, shows in other countries, but you would get more loyal listeners. That's what I believe.
That's a great insight. So the other question I have on the Asian podcasting ecosystem as well. On your studying about the Asian podcasting, have you heard anything about like censorship on podcasting in several Asian country? Is that an issue as well?
It's a great question. The thing is, I have seen episodes that have resulted in creators caught under fire because they've said something. It is not because it's some case, like multiple cases where someone has said something very, very inappropriate, and then that has put the show on the limelight in a very negative fashion, covered by media publications within that country. I'm not going to name any names, but this person has said something really bad about a public figure, like a politician or something like that within the country, and that was listened to, that was reported, and then the show had to issue a public apology, etc., etc., etc. That's a very minimal, shall we say, influence of potential information control. However, I have seen cases not only limited to Asia but also in other regions where not necessarily censorship, but things like arrests or things like actions taken against the creators have been justified because of what has been said and published in an episode. I'm not too sure about some Asian countries where there may be a little bit more freeing in terms of your freedom of speech, but for example, in Malaysia, it's quite conservative in its culture. So if you want to speak out to say about the government, or if you want to speak about public figures, etc., yet you do have to be very careful. This is not even related to just podcasting. This is more on to what extent will you, as a podcaster, take into consideration the governance of the environment that you're trying to penetrate into. We have some bloggers that have got taken down and maybe even jailed because of what they've spoken out. We've had some independent publications that have said critical things, but they didn't insult anything. It's just a critical discussion, but they have had actions taken against them. Podcasting is not excluded from this. It is possible that censorship still plays a part when you are a podcaster trying to gain an audience within an Asian country. I'll leave it at that for now, because I'd rather not discourage someone from thinking, I should not say this because I might get taken down. No. What I'm trying to say here is it is prevalent, it is present, but that means that you should treat your voice, your message, a little bit more professionally so that you're able to express your mission, even if it's a controversial one, in a way where it does not take your position away or give someone the chance to take action against you, because you still need to get your message out there. And I've seen this happen multiple times, and they're doing very, very well in places like Nepal, in places like Philippines, in places like Japan.
Thank you so much. That was a great, insightful explanation, Norman. So, do you think podcasting is oversaturated in Asia, or just not yet?
Oversaturated? No. It's completely undersaturated. Like, this is like the most diluted ever I've ever seen. I'm still like walking around the city in KL, and when I'm talking to someone about podcasting, they're like, "Oh, isn't that just radio?" Like the amount of podcast literacy in Asian countries is still very little compared to other countries around the world. That being said, there are countries in Asia that have podcasts so ingrained into their culture of consuming content that they're going to be perfectly fine. I mean, like South Korea is already the highest at 58% listenership rate, the highest more than the US, more than any other country in the world, because they've been podcasting since 2005. Like, that's insane. You could just go to like Busan or Seoul and just say podcast. People will be like, "Oh yeah, I know what that is." Or you can go to India, right? India, I'm sure, just a whole variety of podcasts there, both in English as well as in local languages. But in say Southeast Asian countries, it's going to be a hit or miss if you're going to start talking to someone about podcasts. And even if they do know, they might not know local podcasts. They might know like American podcasts or the podcasts that are created by high level production studios that are just, they're all overseas. So it's going to be very hard for them to look at what's happening here. Now, to talk about saturation, I would say no, mainly because from a financial standpoint, there's still opportunities for companies who are trying to get into the podcast advertising pie, or the available demand for local language content, or podcasts rather, by hungry listeners, because listeners are not going to be they're not stuck at one show once they've just started listening to podcasts. They're always eager to listen to others. That's why we have podcasters collaborating with each other all the time. In terms of the future for like saturation, etc., the only way the only way a podcasting market within Asia will get saturated is when all of the resources pulled into other mediums are taken out from there and then just put into podcasting. But that is very, very highly unlikely, because when we talk about saturation of the podcast market, the word saturation is contextual. It sounds like it's bad. There's a negative connotation to it. But we have 2.5 million shows worldwide right now. It's even then, that's not saturated at all. Like, globally speaking, podcasting is not saturated at all compared to other things, right? We have 2.5 million shows. How many blogs are there? How many YouTube channels are there? How many radio shows are out there? These are all mediums. We're comparing medium to medium. And in Asia, to be honest, we are not oversaturated. We are hungry for more shows built from a local perspective.
All right, thank you for that. So you mentioned YouTube, Norman. What is your opinion on, because a lot of content creator in YouTube is going into podcasting. Is that good for a podcaster like us, that some YouTube creator go into an audio via podcasting?
I have mixed feelings about this, but I'm leaning more towards good. The rationale is that sometimes podcasters, we can be a little bit protective of what is considered the ideal podcast experience. And we've always known podcasting to be something that does not have any relation to video at all. It is a show that does not require you to stare at a screen for 1 hour or 2 hours, as people are just doing exactly what we're doing right now. But you see my mouth, you see my face, and I'm just going, right? Like, my mouth is just opening and closing, and then it's just synchronized with the audio that you could just listen in your headphones. In terms of YouTube, the relationship between YouTube and podcasts, it's a great timing because YouTube is already starting to hire people to set up their podcasting arm. That's pretty awesome. A lot of Asian YouTube content creators, or YouTubers essentially, they see this gateway into podcasting via their what they've built, their body of work on YouTube. And that's great because they are introducing their audience into the medium of podcasting, even if it's not exactly the ideal way to do so, but it is still a good way to expose people to the definition of podcasting so that we can normalize that word and make it a lot easier for people to one day, once they've stopped looking at this YouTuber's videos or shows, they're like, oh, I like podcasting, but I'm tired of this person's stuff. Where else can I go for podcasting? And they will find a whole genre, a whole variety of more shows over time. So YouTubers coming into podcasting is always a good thing, because that just means that there will just be more listeners. There'll be more potential listeners. And we're not going to complain about more listeners. Like, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like, I'm not going to be like, hey, you come in from YouTube? No, you're not allowed to listen to my show. No, that's just dumb. No, that's just dumb. My only negative, or my only disagreement with this gateway into podcasting via YouTube is that sometimes, and I've actually had this experience with people here when I was consulting them on a podcast. Some people think that podcasts are just YouTube shows. It's just a word to describe some videos on YouTube where people are talking. And that's, to me, a little bit lacking, because if I were to try to find your YouTube show on Spotify, I can't, because your feed is not on there. I can't listen to you while I'm taking a walk. I have to sit down at my laptop and then be like, oh, okay, I can finally listen. I must listen by staring at something. And of course, we have active listeners, but then the beauty of podcasting is that you can also passively listen. You can also listen while washing the dishes or taking a walk or something like that. So there's that confusion happening. But then we also then have a duty to also inform people. Yes, podcasting is not just limited to YouTube. Podcasting can exist and dissociate itself away from YouTube. And there's plenty more than just a video with audio onto it. So yeah, mixed feelings.
All right, I agree with you. Do you think, and on the future, probably in 3 to 5 years time, there will be Asian podcasting ecosystem can be what happened to the Western space? Like, Spotify is buying Joe Rogan. Now Spotify is buying Call Her Daddy by Alex Cooper. Do you think it's gonna be happening in Asian as well?
That's pretty funny that you brought up Spotify because they're already doing this. They've already bought like, what was it, 6 to 7 exclusives in Indonesia. The Indonesian podcasting market is very interesting because they love their horror. Like horror is like their best genre. So Spotify has looked at the market numbers and they're like, oh, okay, we're seeing people interested in this show. Let's scoop them up, right? Let's just put them on our show. And looking at Spotify's activity is a great way to predict the future of Asian listener behavior, which is where we're supposed to look at when we're looking at ecosystems here, right? We want to look at where people are designed or trained to quench their thirst for a podcast by opening their phone, clicking any app, and then clicking on a show and then listening. It could be Spotify, it could be anywhere else. Would you say 3 to 5 years? I would say 4 to 5 years. But to twist your question a little bit, it's not that we'll be seeing that. It's I think in 3 to 5 years we'll be seeing more of the activity in greater frequency, because in India it's happening a lot. We're seeing a number of production houses. We're seeing a number of buyouts, definitely by Spotify. That's like Spotify is leading a lot of this, and at the same time we're seeing more and more independent production houses. The reason why they're able to persist is that there's a demand. There are skilled talents that can collaborate and congregate together, and that they are able to maintain their integrity as a podcasting company within these countries that you and I have just been talking about for the past 20-30 minutes, that are still maybe not as absolute. It's still a bit confusing. It's still a bit gray. People might still not know what a podcast is, but they still try because they're all believing in this prediction that yes, more and more of these will be in greater frequency. But I think something to think about instead of buyouts by Spotify, I think I'm more interested in potential investments. Like people actually injecting in money for a high production quality show. People actually interested in creating something that's NPR level, but only fun in Singapore. NPR level, but only fun in South Korea. Maybe we'll find a very powerful, amazing show, but it's found within North Korea. That would be amazing. Like I would totally listen to that, because that's a one of a kind experience, and you're not going to find that in, say, US, UK, any Western market ever.
Yeah, that's gonna be interesting. We'll have to listen that as well. So if you have a billboard to write one piece of advice to all our listeners and to our audience who's watching this video as well, what would you say to people who is looking to start their own podcast that is live in Asia?
Say a billboard. Do I have limits? Like, could I like do a whole like spiel? I'm trying to think.
It's
like,
up to you.
No, normally a billboard. Okay, well, components of a billboard is that it has to attract you immediately. You're a thriving podcaster. You want to make your name. You want to, put your name down in the history of podcasting, especially within Asia. You want to make a mark. These country-specific attributes, they're not hindrances, they are advantages unique to you building your show. Oh, I do have one. It's not specifically podcasting, but let me twist it for this context. The world is very forgiving of what you do. So here's the thing. I did not learn any of this when I started episode 1 of my very first show. I wasn't like, hey, let me find a podcast to give me an idea of the industry before I dive into it. No. I had my interest. I had the desire to. I had my script, which is my story, and I had a microphone, and I just talked into it. That was it. I did not think about, oh, will I be judged, or will I be canceled, or will someone hate me for, pushing this story out? No, the world was quite forgiving the very first time I released my first episode. If you are a podcaster interested in tackling any Asian country, sometimes some of the fears that might come up when you're starting your first show, when you're like planning, may compel you to do things that do not actually help in publishing your first episode. Things like, oh, I don't know enough about the Philippines, so let me read everything about it before I start episode 1. No, most shows don't start off like that. Most shows start off flawed. When they start off flawed, their ability to accept the flaws in their show will compel them to publish more and more. Mastery is not done at first step. Mastery is done over time. It is a gradual process, and podcasting in itself is a gradual process. If you can understand that, if you can embody that, then you will do perfectly well as a podcaster within Asia, as well as a podcaster in general. Because even if you're trying to tackle a specific market, for example, you're still going to get listeners all around the world. So you will do just fine. People, listeners, creators, companies, just people around the world, they will forgive you for the show that you're about to put out. So don't worry and just hit record.
All right, that's a great advice. Thank you so much, Norman. So if someone want to connect with you online, how they can contact you?
Yeah, sure. So there are 2 ways. One is to message me on Twitter. So I'm at Norman Chella. I'll probably send you the link for that. I'm quite active on there. Twitter is my game, basically. Although I'm not always talking about podcasting, I talk about other things as well, but I pretty much breathe this medium. So I'm actually very, very happy to talk there. But if you want to go into a deep dive, a discovery call, want to test your ideas, I provide discovery calls and, podcast consulting calls for people. So you can just email me, Norman at rngdr.com, and we can, get, if you need, you elevate your process there, your production, whatever, we've got a whole team to help you out. So just contact me that way.
All right, thank you so much, Norman. So all the links will be in the show notes. Please click above on the show notes subscription, so everything will there. And Norman is happy to have a chat with you, particularly on Twitter, which is I'm also loving the Twitter now. All right, thank you so much, Norman. Enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you so much for another episode of That Podcast Exchange. And see you next week. See ya. Bye.
Right, thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Guerrilla Podcast Syndicate, powered by Kangaroo Fern Media Lab. Kangaroo Fern is Australia's independent video and podcast management agency with the mission to help individuals and entrepreneurs to start their own podcast and harness the power of podcasting. Book now via www.kangaroofern.com.